In this part of the series, I'll show you a bit of the installation process for a vapor on one of my scooters. This scooter is a stripped-down 2004 Vento Triton powered by a clone of the Minarelli Jog 2-stroke engine. As with any electrical work, it's a good practice to disconnect the battery before you begin. Routing wires and mounting components may require removing plastics, so I like to get any that I'm certain will be in the way removed from the start. Luckily for me, this scooter has very few body panels. You can install most components in pretty much any order you'd like, but I prefer to start with mounting the gauge. In this case, I'm using the supplied handlebar mount. Attach the vapor mount to the handlebar mount, leaving the connection loose enough that it is able to move. Then secure the vapor to its mount with the provided countersunk screws. Put the mount over the handlebars, not bending the bracket any more than you need to. Use a screw and nut to partially tighten the bracket to the bars. Leave it loose enough that you can reposition the bracket for now. Find the position that you prefer the gauge to be in, and then tighten the bar mount and the bracket so that it no longer moves. Here's a look at another option for scooters with handlebar covers. In this case, I removed the stock gauge assembly and cut a piece of ABS plastic to fill the void. The plastic was then epoxied to the underside of the handlebar cover to give it a clean outward appearance. I used a large amount of epoxy, so mine is messy on the underside where no one usually sees. I have seen others screw or rivet a panel into place. Once the panel is in place, all you need to do is drill holes for the vapor to mount to and for wires to pass through. Next, I worked on the speedometer components, beginning with a little test fitting to see what I liked. You will need to find a way to mount a magnet on the wheel or brake rotor, and to mount the sensor on a stationary part so that the magnet passes the sensor with each wheel rotation and with a gap between the two of 1/2 inch or less. Mounting the magnet to the outer rim of the wheel and putting the speed sensor on the front fork looked like the easiest option for me. I removed the front wheel because I planned to epoxy the magnet on, and I didn't want the epoxy to run downward while it cured, as it tends to do with the wheel sitting upright on the scooter. Clean and dry the wheel and tire, and then clean the surface where the magnet will mount with isopropyl alcohol. Apply epoxy to the underside of the magnet and place it where you want it on the wheel. Then I like to build up around the magnet with a little extra epoxy. I don't know that it's necessary, but so far I haven't lost a magnet in over 10 years of doing it this way. I have always used JB Weld for this job, which is a very popular, commonly available product. Give the epoxy its full recommended cure time before use. You will probably want to work on other things while the epoxy cures if you use this method, but I'll continue on with everything cured through the magic of editing. Clean the fork thoroughly where the speed sensor will mount, using rubbing alcohol to finish. Then double check that the setup will work before installing the sensor. Installation may be easier with the wire disconnected from the sender. I use a small pick or screwdriver to push the tab as shown and then pull to disconnect. This type of sensor easily sticks on with the included attached double-sided tape. Apply a bit of pressure for a few seconds to be sure that you get good contact everywhere. Before going any further, the speed sensor should be tested. Connect the wire to the sender. Then connect the other end to the connection from the vapor without a label that matches the speed sending wire's connector. Keep the wire out of the way of moving parts, but otherwise don't be concerned about its routing for now. Rotate the front wheel and watch the vapor's display. You should see it light up and register speed as the magnet passes the sensor. If not, double check your connections and you may need to adjust the gap between the wheel and the sensor or align them different. As long as it works, you can disconnect the speed sensor wire from one end and route it properly from sensor to gauge so that it is not near any moving parts. You may secure it with cable ties now, or wait until you have all the wires routed to secure them together. Make sure you leave enough slack that the fork can turn fully in both directions without the wire becoming taut. If the wire is a bit long, you can coil it up and cable tie it to take up the unnecessary slack. Once it's routed and reconnected at both ends, check the operation of the speedometer again before moving on. Next, I installed the cylinder head temperature probe. In this case, I used the underplug thermistor. Begin by removing the spark plug. Then you'll need to remove the crush washer from the spark plug. They can usually be grabbed by hand or with pliers and unscrewed from the plug. You may also cut through the crush washer with wire cutters and remove it that way. Just be careful not to damage the threads on the spark plug. The sensor should slide or thread over the end of the plug as shown, so the flat side will be toward the engine. You can try to reinstall the plug with the sensor now, but more work may be required for a proper fit in some applications. On my air-cooled Chinese two-strokes, I have found a couple of minor issues. One is that the engine shroud may need to be cut or filed to make room for the sensor where the wires protrude. It's not always necessary, but makes getting the spark plug in and out easier. Make sure you cover the spark plug hole if you do this without removing the shroud to prevent debris from getting into your engine. Then a file, rotary tool, or razor can be used to make a cutout. Sometimes the fins on air-cooled heads also get in the way of the sensor, not letting it seat against the head properly without bending, or causing difficulty installing the plug. In those cases, I use a rotary tool and carbide burr to take off just enough of the cooling fin to get a good fit with a little room for movement of the sensor. This can be done with the head installed, but the spark plug hole must be blocked off during the cutting. Once you get the sensor installed, you can move on to testing to see if the sensor works. You will probably need an extension because the supplied wires aren't long enough even for direct routing in many cases. Extensions snap in easily, just like the other connectors. The larger unmarked connection from the vapor is for the temperature sender. Before you test the temperature sender, hold the left and mode buttons until you see the RPM bar flash. As long as you have everything clear of hot or moving parts, you can start the engine and let it warm up a little to be sure the temperature sender works before moving on. You'll need to get the engine above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the gauge to start working. If you can't easily start the engine at this stage, you could leave the sender out and use a heat gun or even a lighter held at a distance to test the temperature probe. Now you can begin routing and securing the wires if you wish. I chose to wait until I wired the RPM wires in because they are in the same area and can take the same path to the gauge. The tachometer only uses one wire to pick up a signal, and it can be installed a couple of ways. The fastest and easiest way is to wrap the end of the RPM signal wire around the spark plug wire. Trailtech recommends 5 times around as a starting point. I use electrical tape to secure it around the plug wire. I chose to connect the RPM wire to the wire leading to the positive side of the ignition coil instead. I think it makes the installation a little bit cleaner. You'll need to figure out which wire to the coil is the positive side first. With most of the scooters that I've worked on, the negative or ground connection of the coil is solid black or green, or the ground is obtained through a frame mount and no ground wire is present. Through the process of elimination, that leaves only one wire that could be the positive wire on the coil. In the example of my Taotal shown here, the wire is black with a yellow stripe. You may be able to use a wiring diagram to verify if this is correct. You could also use a multimeter to see which wire goes to ground and which does not. I set my multimeter to ohms to read resistance. The black probe should go to a good frame ground. Make sure it's a clean spot, free of paint or rust. Touch the red probe to ground as well, and your meter should display a value near 0 ohms. It's normal for the number to not be exactly 0. Now try touching the red probe to one of the 2 coil wires. When you touch the wire for the negative side of the coil, you should see a number near 0, just as you did when you touched a known ground with the red probe. When you check the wire that is the positive side of the coil, your meter should show what looks like 0L. This is to indicate an open loop or no continuity. The wire with no continuity to ground is the one that you want to tap into for a tach signal. The simple way to tap in is to use a quick splice terminal like this one that you can find at most auto parts stores. You should see that one side is open straight through and the other is blocked. The wire you're tapping into goes into the open side. The wire for the tach goes into the blocked side. Then pliers are used to squeeze the metal plate which pierces and connects both wires. Snap the cover down and your connection is completed. I prefer to solder the signal wire into the positive coil wire instead. I use wire strippers to cut through the insulation on the coil wire in two spots about 1/8 of an inch apart. Then the center section of the insulation can be removed by making a slit with a razor and pulling it off. Strip back 1 inch or 2 of the black wire covering on the tach wire. Then strip about 1/2 inch of insulation from the wire and twist the copper together. I apply a little soldering flux to the coil wire. Then wrap the tach wire around it and put another dab of flux on so it's ready for solder. Once soldered, electrical tape can be applied and the connection is complete. Connect the other end of the RPM signal wire to the plug from the vapor labeled tach. Make sure everything is clear of hot or moving objects and start the scooter to see if the tachometer is working. If you aren't getting a reading or if it's erratic, you may have connected to the wrong wire or the connection may not be good. If you use the wire wrap method, you may need to try more or less wraps around the spark plug wire to improve the signal. Don't worry if RPM seems too high or low right now. Settings can be changed later to get the correct readings as long as the vapor is getting a good signal. Now you can properly route and secure the wires from the tach to the vapor, or again wait to secure more wires that you may not have installed yet along with it. At this point, all of my sensors were working, so all the vapor needed was a power source to be fully functional. I connected mine to battery power, which is the recommended way, but the vapor can even be connected to the stator when no 12-volt system is available. I started by connecting the power leads to the connection from the vapor marked as power. Then I ran the wires to the battery. A 0.5 amp fuse should be used on the positive lead, so I separated the black and red wires, trimmed the red wire to a length that works with a fuse holder without too much excess, and then soldered the red wire to the fuse holder and used heat shrink over the connection. I installed a ring terminal on the end, and the positive wire was complete. Then I cut the black wire to length after seeing how much was needed to reach the negative battery terminal and installed a ring terminal. All that was left of the power wiring was to connect the battery cables to the battery. Once connected to a 12-volt source, the vapor's backlight should illuminate. After all of the sensors and power wires are connected, all wiring should be secured. Then any body panels or other parts can be reinstalled and the installation is almost finished. Watch part 3 of this video to see how to change the vapor settings and make it accurate.